The actor and comedian Stanley Holloway has died at the age of 91. So now, in place of his usual programme, Benny Green presents a tribute to Stanley Holloway.
To say goodbye to a man like Stanley Holloway is, of course, a loss. To say goodbye to any gifted person constitutes a loss, and Holloway was gifted to a degree so extraordinary that it wasn't till the later years of his life that even his most devoted followers began to realise exactly how gifted. So, his death diminishes the world's precious stock of originals. But I think in Stanley Holloway's case, the sense of deprival is very much greater, for the simple reason that when he went, he took with him a stock of folklore that's gone forever now. We can never get it back, and the reason why we can't is to do with two factors. Stanley Holloway's extreme old age, he was born back in 1890, and the hysterical pace of change inside the profession he graced. Perhaps I should say professions, because he did so many things and did them all with such breathtaking brilliance that he became one of the rare examples of jack of all trades and master of them all too. How will posterity remember him? As a singer, as a professional Cockney, professional Yorkshireman, as the chronicler of the immortal Albert, as a Shakespearean actor? Who knows? For me, the most fascinating thing about him is the fact that within him resided the entire history of popular entertainment in the modern era. And that's why his very long life, which happened to span the transition from magic lantern to video cassette, is perhaps the symbolic life among all the biographies of all the performers who became world figures. Up almost to the very last, Stanley was an active performer, a modern, and yet when you got him to talk about himself, he plunged you straight back into a quaint and delightful world where England was still a world power, presided over by a grouchy old lady in black bombazine, and popular entertainment was inextricably mixed up with amateur innocence, religious fervour, and insularity.
A Dream of Paradise and The Lost Chord. We used to say the lost chord or the mislaid piece of twine. Yeah. Yeah, A Dream of Paradise. Oh, gosh. And The Lost Chord. That's what I used to sing. And then another one called Oh, Dry Those Tears. They were all very lugubrious, the songs in those days. Very sad they were. Always very sad. Everyone was always crying or dying, or both.
Stanley never seriously considered any life but the stage. Nothing could have stopped him from becoming one of those clowns he so adored.
When I first went, my voice broke as a boy. I went to an office, had to get a job for somewhere. I got 10 shillings a week, sitting on an office stool. So I determined to get out of that as soon as I could.
Ever since he could remember, he had followed the singing comics, learned their songs, exulted in their delivery. Now that scattered repertoire, passed from act to act by word of mouth and destined never to be collated at all in the academic sense, provided him with a foundation for the rest of his life. Although when he sang the old songs, he was inspired, I like to think, by the fond recollection of the original artists whose personalities had caused those songs to be born in the first place. Because in the time of Stanley's childhood and boyhood, songwriting was in that stage of evolution in Britain which likened it to tailoring or hairdressing. It was a sort of personal service.
In those days, the songwriter used to go to an artist and say, I've got an idea for a song, you see. And then you say that, tell them the idea, and then you'd probably have one chorus written. And if it interested them, they'd say, oh, I like that, yeah, finish it. They'd have to pay him, a few bob, which is all they did, give him a few bob to finish the song. And you'd bring it back, and then they'd take a right of it, you see. You might buy it outright. If he was a mug, they could buy it outright, but if he wasn't, they would have a performing right of it, a sole performing right. And that's how these songs, and then of course the musical artists used to work these numbers, work them to get everything out of them. Then when they've passed it on to another number, the publishers used to come in and publish the number. But they never published the number while it was still very popular in those days. They waited till they worked it out and got known by it, and then the publisher would publish it.
So that means that when Stanley revived this or that ancient musical item, he wasn't just reviving a song, he was also celebrating the forgotten lion who had once called that song into being. Every time Stanley went into action in this direction, there was a ghost peeping over his shoulder. The ghost of a musical epoch that had gone forever, but which Stanley cherished and went on cherishing to the very end.
That was a man done by a man called Billy Williams, the man in the velvet suit. He used to have a velvet suit, and he was a marvellous actor. That's all hardly any makeup. He used to have a handkerchief because he used to cry and laugh, and and he used to sing, "Oh, I must go home tonight." There's that one. Jones was the fellow who went around to all his youthful might, and took a great delight in staying home all night. When people were thinking of going to bed, around the streets he'd roam. He'd go to the pubs or to the clubs, but never would go home. Yes, that one. And then, but one night he gave his pals a fright when he said, "I'm going home." And then they thought that he was joking, and they all laughed out aloud. But Jones got very serious as he shouted to the crowd, "Oh, I must go home tonight, I must go home tonight. I don't care if it's blowing, snowing, I'm going. I only got married this morning and it fills me with delight. I'll stay out as late as you like next week, but I must go home tonight." Yes. Jones was a fellow who went the pace with all his youthful might, and took a great delight in staying out all night. When people were thinking of going to bed, around the west he'd roam. He'd go to the clubs or to the pubs, but never would go home. But one night inside the club he gave his pals a fright when he said, "I'm going home," and wished them all good night. They thought that he was joking and they all laughed out aloud. But Jones looked very serious as he shouted to the crowd, "Oh, I must go home tonight, I must go home tonight. I don't care if it's snowing, blowing, I'm going. I only got married this morning and it fills me with delight. I'll stay out as late as you like next week, but I must go home tonight. Oh, I must go home tonight. Oh, I must go home tonight. I don't care if it's blowing, blowing, I'm going. I only got married this morning and it fills me with delight. I'll stay out as long as you like next week."
I think that by far the most revealing thing about that performance is the date when it was made. Later on in Stanley's career, after the fame which came with My Fair Lady had elevated him through the persona of Alfred Doolittle to a position where for a while he could record more or less as he pleased. And he pleased to do all those songs which echoed his childhood back in the lost days of the Edwardian Music Hall. It was almost as though he'd been waiting for the chance all his life, and when that chance came he pounced on it in his resolve to show a new generation how the old one had sounded when it sang to keep its spirits up. But between the musical rumbustiousness of the start and the grand old man status of the end, there were all kinds of intermediate episodes. And if it was My Fair Lady which set the crown on Stanley's career, it was a very famous revue called the Co-Optimists which first spread his reputation in England. The Co-Optimists was really the ultimate version of those pre-First World War concert parties which had given Stanley his start. These troops of singers and jokers used to tour the Edwardian watering places and present wholesome family material, often dressed in the kind of outfits which once tempted me to talk of a land fit for Pierrots to live in. The Co-Optimists opened a lot of doors for Stanley.
That was the thing we had done not in an amateur way, but in a small way for charity shows. David Burnaby, Elsa McFarlane, myself, and I forget one or two others. We used to do a sort of sit round on chairs for a charity show and get up and sing a song and sit down. So I said it was a good idea if we could take just a few prop baskets with hats and moustaches and things and in our own cars and go around the seaside places and put up for 2 nights here and 1 night there and so forth. And he said, yes, it wouldn't be bad, would it? Well, old David Burnaby, he was in the room at the time and he thought, no, we're bringing it to London, right? So that's the place to be. Nobody's going to see wasted at the seaside. And so then David talked about it in the Café Anglais at that time, at lunchtime, and little Laddie Cliff was in there, and he overheard it, and he got in, and Archibald de Bear, who was at the Hippodrome and publicity man, he was there, and they collected £900. £900, that was our total sum to put the show on, 900 quid. And we ran for 6 years right off. And the funny thing was that Archibald de Bear, who was he was a good writer in his way, and he was always writing lyrics, and Melville Giddens wouldn't wear them at all. He said, no, take it away, don't be silly. But that's no good, is it? And so we came back after 1 July, and Archie had been down. He said, the funny thing is, I was down at, I think he said, the Isle of Wight, and he said, I met Arnold Bennett down there. Oh, did you? Yes. He's a very nice man, he is. He's awfully keen on the Co-Optimists. Oh, really? Yes. Yes. In fact, he said he'd written a little song that he thought you might do, you know. So we said, oh, really? Sure. Have you got it? So he said, yeah, I've got it somewhere. And so we said, yes, that's right. So Melville immediately put a tune to it, and we did it for 6 months, and it was a put-up job by Archibald. He'd never met Arnold Bennett in his life. He wrote the song, but he thought, that being a snob value, that Melville would set it to be Arnold Bennett's name. So that was it. And we did it, and I always remember that. It was called the Wild Wild Men of Borneo. They never wear a hat. Their locks are never Shawneo, not Warneo like that. Yes! When the wild, wild men of Borneo, they never wear a hat. Their locks are never Shawneo, not Warneo like that. They go pum, pum, pum on their tom, tom, tom. And yes, very funny. It was a large enough, but we put it on, made some bit of fun. Yeah. Archie de Bear, he was a great leg puller. Marvellous. Happy days.
I have travelled the world over, in the east and in the west, since the day I sailed from Dover on my first romantic quest. I have feasted in the cities, and I've starved upon the plains, and I think I know what grit is. I've had something of the pain. I've had pleasure, I've had leisure, I have found both love and treasure. I've been sad and mad and bad and bound and free. But there's something brings me back from the track and from the shack. 'Tis the lure of London town that calls to me. London town, you haunt me night and day. London town.
The Co-Optimists was one of those shows which ran and ran. They eventually took it off and then they brought it back again and again. And when it finally seemed done for, it was revived yet again and became one of the earliest, if not indeed the very first, British-made movie musical. Although Stanley was always convinced that the makers of the picture had muffed it in their own sweet way. Stanley's talent was not, of course, limited to stuff like the Co-Optimists. His range was perhaps the widest of any British performer of this century, stretching from Shakespeare and Shaw at one extreme to the broadest clowning at the other. One of his greatest achievements, and something again which harks back to his past, was his feat of reviving single-handed the declining art of the comic monologue. In the music hall, men like Bransby Williams had elevated the monologue to a dramatic art, and Dan Leno had gone the other way and refined it to a rich comic weapon. But until Stanley began working that seam in the later 1920s, it was in real danger of disappearing altogether. But before we come to those extraordinary versified fables, let's take a look at a style of musical performance which was a sort of halfway house between song and monologue. And that came about, as much of Stanley's best work did, through his warm friendships with the men who wrote the material. Yet another instance of his professional style harking back to the old musical days when every performer had his entourage of writers. Now, one of Stanley's closest friends was a man called Bob Weston.
Darling Bob Weston, who was stone deaf, you know, poor Bob. But he and Bert Lee used to meet every morning regularly and sit and talk. Bob would give his ideas and Bert Lee would put in what he called the tried and trusted gags, you see. It was old Bert that thought of, gags like, how do you spell consul? Oh, same as tonsil with a K, you know, and all that. And so Bob used to ring me up. He could hear on the many people who are deaf can hear on the telephone. And he used to ring me up. And one day the phone went. He said, "Hey, you, Stan?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Bob West." I said, "Hello, Bob." He said, "I've got a number I think to suit you." I said, "Good." He said, "When would you like to hear it?" I said, "Anytime you like." He said, "Today?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Where should we go?" He said, "Francis Down on it." I said, "Yes." I said, "Yes, that's so." So when, and young Bob, Bob Harris Weston, his son, who wrote all the music for them, he was there and he played the piano. And I could tell immediately because it was perfectly legitimate. She walks the bloody tower, and so that was it. And at that time I was in the show with Harry Pepper's White Coons. And so this particular week, Harry said, what song are you going to sing this week? I said, "This one." So he put the music up and played it, and I sang it. And he stopped after I said, "She walks the bloody tower." Oh, he said, "You can't do that." I said, "Why not?" He said, "You couldn't sing that over the air." Well, I said, "Well, I didn't say why not." He said, "Well, you can't say bloody over the air." And so we called down Eckersley. Roy Eckersley was a director of programs. He came down from the top of he was at the top of it. And he went in the control room, and Harry said, "Sing it again to Roy." I went straight to the microphone and sang it perfectly straight. And when I finished it, I went in the control room, and Roy was sort of, I could see him laughing again. So I said, "What do you think, Roy?" He said, "Well," he said, "what do you think?" I said, "I think you should go over." I said, "I'm not using an adjective, I'm using a proper noun. You might say the Albert Hall, the Tower of London, the Bloody Tower, they're all proper nouns." I said, "You may have some people who take exception, but you've got a perfect answer, therefore you've got perfect publicity." He said, "Right, let it go." And of course it was a wonderful success, they loved it.
In the Tower of London, large as life, the ghost of Anne Boleyn walks, they declare. Poor Anne Boleyn was once King Henry's wife. until he made the headsman bob her hair. Ah, yes, he did a wrong long years ago, and she comes up at night to tell him so, with her head tucked underneath her arm. She walks the bloody tower with her head tucked underneath her arm at the midnight hour. She comes to haunt King Henry, she means giving him what for. Gadzook, she's going to tell him off for having spilt her gore. And just in case the headsman wants to give her an encore, she has her head tucked underneath her arm, with her head tucked underneath her arm. She walks the bloody tower with her head tucked underneath her arm at the midnight hour. Along the drafty corridors for miles and miles she goes. She often catches cold, poor thing. It's cold there when it blows, and it's awfully awkward for the Queen to have to blow her nose with her head tucked underneath her arm. Sometimes gay King Henry gives a spread for all his gals and pals, a ghostly crew. The headsman carves the joint and cuts the bread. Then in comes Anne Boleyn to queer the do. She holds her head up with a wild war whoop, and Henry cries, "Don't drop it in the soup." With her head tucked underneath her arm, she walks the bloody tower with her head tucked underneath her arm at the midnight hour. The sentries think that it's a football that she carries in, and when they've had a few, they shout, "Is Arsenal going to win?" They think it's Alec James instead of poor old Anne Boleyn, with her head tucked underneath her arm, with her head tucked underneath her arm. She walks the bloody tower with her head tucked underneath her arm at the midnight hour. One night she caught King Henry, he was in the canteen bar. Said he, "Are you Jane Seymour, Anne Boleyn, or Catherine Parr? For how the sweet and fairy Anne do I know who you are? With your head tucked underneath your arm."
That performance was delivered in what you might call Stanley's classless London accent. It was one of his most powerful and, for me, most endearing effects. It actually represented London for me, just as his portrayal of the suburban householder, which he did seriously in Noel Coward's This Happy Breed, and more facetiously in Ealing comedies like Passport to Pimlico and The Lavender Hill Mob. They seem to express something absolutely intrinsic to London. And I think to a London that's long since gone. A London whose citizens still had a sense of identity and a sense of pride in being where they were. The irony is that Stanley, who was born in the same suburbs he so eloquently symbolised, was thought for years by the bulk of the public to be a northerner, and more specifically a Yorkshireman. although the one piece of work that gave them this impression was actually placed in Lancashire, to be more precise, Blackpool. Of all the many things Stanley did supremely well, the variety of appearances, the classic acting, the singing, the dancing, it's the comic monologue about Albert and the Lion that may well be remembered the longest. It's part of our folk culture now, along with Greensleeves, Colonel Bogey, Baa Black Sheep, Pack Up Your Troubles, and all the rest of that versified jumble we carry around with us. But why the northern accent?
Well, I was with the Yorkshire Regiment for a long time in the First World War. I was drafted up to Yorkshire. And I realised that it's so confidential. It's more confidential in the softer vowels, you know, the bloody, you see, and the so, and that, and that, and that. It's more confidential than the Cockney, I always thought. May have been wrong, but then it seemed to get by, although the real Yorkshire people or Lancashire people, I never differentiated between Yorkshire and Lancashire, not wishing to start another Wars of the Roses, you know, so I just said it was a northern, you know. Weston and Lee put one or two Yorkshire bits in, because Bert Lee came from Yorkshire.
There's a famous seaside place called Blackpool that's noted for fresh air and fun. And Mr. and Mrs. Ramsbottom went there with young Albert, their son. A grand little lad was young Albert, all dressed in his best, quite a swell, with a stick with an horse's head handle, the finest that Woolworths could sell. They didn't think much to the ocean, the waves they was fiddling and small, there was no wrecks and nobody drowned, in fact nothing to laugh at all. So seeking for further amusement, they paid and went into the zoo, where they'd lions and tigers and camels, and old ale and sandwiches too. There were one great big lion called Wallace. His nose was all covered with scars. He lay in a somnolent posture with the side of his face on the bars. Now Albert had heard about lions, how they was ferocious and wild. To see Wallace lying so peaceful, well, it didn't seem right to the child. So straightway the brave little fella, not showing a morsel of fear, took his stick with his horse's head handle and shoved it in Wallace's ear. You could see that the lion didn't like it, for giving a kind of a roll, he pulled Albert inside the cage with him and swallowed the little lad whole. Then Pa, who had seen the occurrence and didn't know what to do next, said, "Mother, yon lion's it, Albert." And Mother said, "Eee, I am vexed." Then Mr. and Mrs. Ramsbottom, quite rightly when all's said and done, complained to the animal keeper that the lion had eaten their son. The keeper was quite nice about it. He said, "What a nasty mishap. Are you sure that it's your boy he's eaten?" Pa said, "Am I sure? There's his cap." The manager had to be sent for. He came and he said, "What's to do?" Pa said, "Yon lion's et Albert, and him in his Sunday clothes too." Then Mother said, "Right's right, young fella. I think it's a shame and a sin for a lion to go and eat Albert, and after we'd paid to come in." The manager wanted no trouble. He took out his purse right away, saying how much to settle the matter. Pa says, "What do you usually pay?" But Mother had turned a bit awkward when she thought where our Albert had gone. She said, "No, someone's got to be summoned." So that was decided upon. Then off they went to the police station in front of the magistrate chap. They told him what happened to Albert and proved it by showing his cap. The magistrate gave his opinion that no one was really to blame, and he said that he hoped the Ramsbottoms would have further sons to their name. At that Mother got proper blazing. "And thank you, sir, kindly," said she. "What, waste all our lives raising children to feed ruddy lions? Not me."
But the technique which expressed Albert's saga, the monologue, delivered in the authentic lugubrious tones of the straight-faced comedian, was sometimes wedded to the more conventional vocal technique to produce talk song masterpieces, a little different in approach from Rex Harrison's Professor Higgins, but just as impressive in their way.
"I've been very poorly, but now I feel prime. I've been out today for the very first time. I felt like a lad as I walked down the road. Then I met old Jones and he said, well, I'm blowed. My word, you do look queer. My word, you do look queer. Oh dear, you look dreadful. You've had an ear shave. You look like a man with one foot in the grave. I said, Bosh, I'm better. It's true I've been ill. He said, I'm delighted you're better, but still, I wish you'd 1,000 for me and you will. My word, you do look queer. That didn't improve me. It quite put me back. Still, I walked farther on and I met Cousin Jack. He looked at me hard and he murmured, gee whiz. It's like him. It can't be. It isn't. It is. By gosh, who'd have thought it? Well, well, I declare, I'd never have known you except for your hair. My word, you do look queer. My word, you do look queer. Your cheeks are all sunk and your colour's all gone. Your neck's very scraggy. Still, you're getting on. How old are you now? About 50, that's true. Your father died that age. Your mother did too. Well, the black clothes I wore then will come in for you. My word, you do look queer. That really upset me. I felt quite cast down. But I tried to buck up, and then up came old Brown. He stared at me hard, then he solemnly said, you shouldn't be out, you should be home in bed. I heard you were bad. Well, I heard you were gone. You look like a corpse with an overcoat on. My word, you do look queer. My word, you do look queer. You'd best have a brandy before you drop dead. So pale as a sheet, I crawled in the King's Head. The barmaid sobbed, oh, you poor fellow, and then she said, on the slate you owe just £1.10. You better pay up, we shan't see you again. My word, you do look queer. My knees started knocking, I did feel so sad. Then Brown said, don't die in a pub, it looks bad. He said, come with me, I'll show you what to do. Now I've got a friend who'll be useful to you. He led me to Black's undertaking depot, and Black, with some crepe round his hat, said, hello? My word, you do look queer. My word, you do look queer. Now we'll fix you up for a trifling amount. Now, what do you say to a bit on account? I said, I'm not dying. He said, don't say that. My business of late has been terribly flat. But I'm telling my wife she can have that new hat. My word, you do look queer. I crawled in the street and I murmured, I'm done. Then up came old Jenkins and shouted, oh, son! My word, you do look well. My word, you do look well. You're looking fine and in the pink. I shouted, am I? Come and have a drink. You put new life in me. I'm sounder than a bell. By gad, there's life in the old dog yet. My word, I do feel well.
We can laugh over a song and a performance like that, but Stanley would have insisted that the springs of our laughter rested in a time we never knew, decades ago, when the men who first tickled his fancy were in their prime. I talked to him a few times about what are sometimes laughingly called the good old days, and I never failed to be absolutely enchanted by his ability to call up the spirits of the dead, to paint you brilliant little sketches of men you had heard about but been much too young to have known. Stanley had this extraordinary gift of total recall when it came to his profession. In one of his several earlier forays into musical comedy, Stanley sang the music of Jerome Kern.
Oh, yeah, darling man. He's a funny little man. Always wore, for a tie, a paisley scarf, you know, done into a big sailor's knot. Yeah, and funny little beaky little man, darling little man. But he hated them. He hated the peroxided blondes, and if he saw the girls lined up one morning at rehearsal, and he saw poor Iris Tully, I remember her name, and he said, I don't want her, he said, if you can't get that hair changed by tomorrow, otherwise she's out. And this poor girl had sat up all night having her hair changed. She did. He couldn't bear them. It was like, you know, anathema, I think is the, yeah. He couldn't bear peroxided blondes. He wouldn't mind a natural one, but anyone with peroxide, you know, he wouldn't have them. He was a nice little man. Sweet little man. I'm old-fashioned. I love
the moonlight. I love the old-fashioned themes, the sound of rain upon a window pane, the starry song that April sings. This year's fancies are passing fancies, but sighing sighs, holding hands, these my heart understands. I'm old-fashioned, but I don't mind it. That's how I want to be, as long as you agree to stay old-fashioned with me. This year's fancies are passing fancies, but sighing sighs, holding hands, these my heart understands. I'm old-fashioned, but I don't mind it. That's how I want to be, as long as you agree to stay old-fashioned with me.
That interpretation of Jerome Kern brings us much closer to the American school of musical comedy writers, whose descendants, in the form of Lerner and Loewe, eventually made Stanley Holloway a world as distinct from a British celebrity. Lerner and Loewe settled on Stanley as Doolittle before they'd even completed the songs he was to make famous. They knew their man.
Alan and Fritz came over to London and played me, I think, was it Get Me to the Church? Yes, I think it was. The tune, anyway. I don't think Alan had done the lyric.
There's just a few more hours, that's all the time you've got. A few more hours before they tie the knot.
There's drinks and girls all over London, and I've got to track 'em down in just a few more hours.
I'm getting married in the morning. Ding dong, the bells are gonna chime. Pull out the stopper, let's have a whopper, and get me to the church on time. I got to be there in the morning, spruced up and looking in me prime. Girls, come and kiss me, show how you'll miss me, but get me to the church on time. If I am dancing, roll up the floor. If I am whistling, let me out the door. For I'm getting married in the morning. Ding dong, the bells are gonna chime. Kick up a rumpus, but don't lose the compass, and get me to the church. Get me to the church, be sure and get me to the church on time. I'm getting married in the morning. Ding dong, the bells are gonna chime. Drag me or jail me, stab me and mail me, but get me to the church on time. I got to be there in the morning, spruced up and looking in me prime. Some bloke
table, lift up the table, and get me to the church on high. If I am flying, then shoot me down. If I am wooing, get her out of town. For I get married in the morning. Ding dong, never but a song. Feather and Tommy, call out the army to get me to the church. Get me to the church. Oh, sure. And get me to the church.
There's one till I got over in New York at Alan's apartment, and Moss Hart was there, and Alan said, I'd like to play Stanley, he never heard the number, A Little Bit of Luck. And Alan, of course, wonderful at selling his own numbers, and Fritz sat down the piano and played it, Alan sang it. I thought, what a wonderful number, you know.
The Lord above gave man an arm of iron, so he could do his job and never shirk. The Lord above gave man an arm of iron, but with a little bit of luck, with a little bit of luck, someone else will do the blinking work. With a little bit, with a little bit, with a little bit of luck, you'll never work. The Lord above made liquor for temptation, to see if man could turn away from sin. The Lord above made liquor for temptation, but with a little bit of luck, with a little bit of luck, when temptation comes you'll give right in. With a little bit, with a little bit, with a little bit of luck you'll give right in. Oh, you can walk the straight and narrow, but with a little bit of luck you'll run amok. The gentle sex was made for man to marry, to share his nest and see his food is cooked. The gentle sex was made for man to marry, but with a little bit of luck, with a little bit of luck, you can have it all and not get hooked. With a little bit, with a little bit, with a little bit of luck, you won't get hooked. With a little bit, with a little bit, with a little bit of blooming love. The Lord above made man to help his neighbour, no matter where, on land or sea or foam. The Lord above made man to help his neighbour, but with a little bit of luck, with a little bit of luck, when he comes around you won't be home. With a little bit, with a little bit, with a little bit of luck you won't be home. They're always throwing goodness at you, but with a little bit of luck a man can duck. Oh, it's a crime for man to go philandering and fill his wife's poor heart with grief and doubt. Oh, it's a crime for man to go philandering, but with a little bit of luck, with a little bit of luck, you can see the bloodhound don't find out. With a little bit, with a little bit, with a little bit of luck, she won't find out. With a little bit, with a little bit, with a little bit of blooming love. A man was made to help support his children, which is the right and proper thing to do. A man was made to help support his children, but with a little bit of luck, with a little bit of luck, they'll go out and start supporting you. With a little bit, with a little bit, with a little bit of luck they'll work for you. He doesn't have a tuppence in his pocket, the poorest clown you'll ever hope to meet. He doesn't have a tuppence in his pocket, with a little bit of luck, with a little bit of luck, he'll be moving up to Wasey Street. With a little bit, with a little bit, with a little bit of luck, he'll move it up.
The most striking thing about those two Shavian hymns from My Fair Lady is that in them, Lerner and Lowe cleverly echoed the old music hall. Both of those songs could have fitted the morality of the Oxford Music Hall or the Tivoli without anybody noticing anything wrong with them. They were, in fact, brilliant pastiches of the very tradition that Stanley loved best of all, a tradition which was still intact in his head, even if the performers who represented that tradition were long since dead and gone and forgotten by everyone, except Stanley.
A man called Phil Ray he was on the bill at the Tivoli too. The abbreviating comic he was. I was not feeling right, so I went down to Bright to spend a few mins by the sea. On Victoria Platt, I patiently sat with my little portmanteau on my knee. We reached Stepney Junk at 3:30 punk. As the train shunted into the station, said the guard, "Make a start, room for one, this compart." I said, "Thanks for your kind information." That was Phil Ray. And he was so blind, he used to be on the stage, and his dress used to wait with his glasses. They came up and he'd put them on, and he'd be like, just blind as a bat. I remember he had a lovely gag. He said, I remember that day particularly, so I was coming out of a pub. Well, you see, we must come out sometimes for meals and get some more money. Yes, oh, it was funny. Yeah, Phil Ray. He was the abbreviating, then there was the shy comedian.
I courted Mary Ellen for 14 solid years, but she made me blush when she one night boldly said to me, "You've never kissed me once, John, though I'd like you to," she sighed. "Why don't you call me pretty names?" I hung my head and cried. I'm shy, Mary Ellen, I'm shy. It does seem so naughty, oh my. Kissing is nicey, I've often heard say, but still how to do it, I don't know the way. So you put your arm round my waist, and I will not struggle or try. And you do the kissing and cuddling instead, 'cause I'm shy, Mary Ellen, I'm shy.
I'm shy, Mary Ellen, I'm shy.
I'm shy.
It does seem so naughty, oh my.
Oh my.
Kissing is nicey, I've often heard say, but still how to do it, I don't know the way. So you put your arm round my waist.
My waist.
I promise I won't scream or cry.
Or cry.
So you do the kissing and cuddling instead, 'cause I'm shy, Mary Ellen, I'm shy.
Last year with Mary Ellen to Lowestoft I went. Mary Ellen said to me, I'm going bathing in the sea. So while I go and have a splash where all the ladies go, you go and have a bathe among the men. I said, no, no. I'm shy, Mary Ellen, I'm shy. It does seem so naughty, oh my. Men are so rough, and I'm sure they will stare. They'll splash me and duck me if I go in there. The girls ain't so rough as the men, and they wouldn't duck me or try. So I'd rather bathe here along with the girls, 'cause I'm shy, Mary Ellen, I'm shy.
Stanley took those songs when he was in his 60s, all over the world, introducing them to cultures that had never heard of them before, and occasionally didn't even understand what Stanley was talking and singing about.
When I went to record in America for that thing, they said, you can't sing that, you know, because he said, fancy seeing mother with her legs all bare, paddling in the fountain in Trafalgar Square, bobbing up and down in the water, would make the policeman frown. And they said, you can't have mother, you know, with her legs all bare. Well, let me do it.
Have you ever noticed when you're by the sea, the things that people do there with impunity? If they did the same things when they're up in town, moral Mrs. Grundy on her face would wear a frown. Father, mother, all the family toddle down to have that little paddle by the sea. Mother takes her stockings up upon the sandy shore and shows a lot of linen that she'd never shown before. You can do a lot of things at the seaside that you can't do in town. Fancy seeing mother with her legs all bare, paddling in the fountain in Trafalgar Square, bobbing up and down in the water. It would make the policeman frown. You can do a lot of things at the seaside that you can't do in town. You can do a lot of things at the seaside that you can't do in town.
It was a brave thing to attempt to educate the Americans in the ways of the English, and perhaps it was impossible. To savour the richness of an authentic Holloway reminiscence, to extract all the marrow from the bone of anecdote, you have, I think, to have been raised in the same streets and breathed the same atmosphere that Stanley did. He had a sort of universal grasp of his own background, his own profession, so that in time, even the villains became rounded with affection, because they had at last conformed to the golden rule of life, which was, of course, they had to be funny, intentionally or otherwise. In the recollections of most performers, the figure of Oswald Stoll bulks small. Nobody seems to have had much affection for him, nor he for anybody. Stoll came out rather badly, for instance, in the historical accounts of the old musical strike of the Edwardian era, and it's doubtful if anyone would have applauded him had he ever plucked up the courage to go on the stage for a living. But in the sparkling panorama of Stanley Holloway's memoirs, Stoll was at last redeemed by humour.
Because he used to wear a frock coat and a silk hat every day. He lived at Putney. Walking down Putney Hill one time, that's how the story goes, of course, and the poor man standing in the gutter selling matches. He said, "Buy a box of matches, Governor?" Sergeant said, "Why?" He said, "Well, we're only taking fourpence all day." He said, "Really? Tell me, how does that compare with the corresponding week of last year?" Yes, he was always, introspective mind. Yes, did we do as well as that last year? Marvellous man, though.
I think that to have lost a raconteur of Stanley's range and relish is indeed a loss irreplaceable. But it is some consolation that of all the great figures in British life, and Stanley was unquestionably a great figure, he recorded his recollections for the BBC as copiously as anybody. He would talk for hours about the life he had so much enjoyed, about his friends and the songs and the plays and the long runs and the flops and the jokes and the gags, all of it, an inspired anthology of a whole epoch of English life. He was one of those performers who came to the front very slowly, at his own pace, on his own terms. No instant stardom, but years, whole decades of steady progress. Stanley once said to me that he found it rather amusing that he'd only ever done one Broadway musical in his life, and only one Hollywood musical, and that they were the same, My Fair Lady, and that he hadn't done them till he was over 60, a time in life when a great many men are thinking of retirement. Well, it turned out, very fortunately for posterity, I always think, that at 60, Stanley was just starting on a fresh phase of experience. To say that I found him lovable is a commonplace. Everybody did. He was an eminently lovable man. When you met him, somewhere underneath the delight and the affection you felt, you also sensed an uneasy feeling in yourself that he represented a breed of Englishman which is rapidly becoming extinct. Solid yet extremely brilliant. Fanciful yet as tough as old boots when the occasion demanded it. Honest, frank, open-hearted. Above all, a man endowed with a most wonderful sense of humour and a moral courage, which I think expressed itself in humorous terms quite naturally. We won't ever see anything remotely resembling Stanley Holloway ever again. He was unique. He was a once and for all time. At which point I might find myself at a loss because I'm unable to know how to finally say goodbye to him. Except that Stanley, inspired to the very end, arranged all that for me with a song he loved very much. When I once asked him where he found it, his face lit up with the sheer pleasure of even thinking about the song. And I do believe that although it's a perilous game ascribing to an artist the sentiments of the song he happens to sing, there was something of Stanley's own philosophy in this song. let it be his last word on the subject.
That was written for Leslie Henson in the Night Out, the Winter Garden, 1920. And Leslie sang it sitting on a wall, I remember. Written by Arthur Anderson, and Melville set it to music. It'll be all the same 100 years from now. No use of worrying, no use of flurrying, no use kicking up a row. For you won't be here, and I won't be here when 100 years have gone. And somebody else will be well in the cart, but the world will still go on. Yes, good philosophy that is. It's probably true. That's why I used to end, when I did a one-man show in America, I always ended with that number, because it was a lovely finishing number. You won't be here, and I won't be here when 100 years have gone, but somebody else will be well in the soup, but the world will still go on. Yes, lovely.
I'm afraid we must leave you now, but if you're worried about anything, let me leave you with this comforting thought.
It'll be all the same, just the same, 100 years from now. No use of worrying, no use of flurrying, no use kicking up a row. For I won't be here, and you won't be here when 100 years have gone. And somebody else will be well in the cart, but the world will still go